Families are supposed to be your ultimate safety net, but mine operated like a ruthless financial guillotine. For decades, they labeled me a toxic, worthless liability. They refused to invest a single dime in my future. Today, my empire is worth $500 million, and their bank accounts are empty. If you want to understand how a family breaks, you have to look at the dining room table. Ours was a massive, custom-built mahogany beast that my mother, Sylvia, insisted we ship all the way from Italy. It was designed to seat 12, but it usually only seated the 5 of us, leaving vast, polished, empty spaces between our plates. Looking back, that table was a perfect metaphor for our family. Expensive, rigid, and incredibly cold. My father, Richard, was a man who viewed his children not as human beings, but as line items on a corporate balance sheet. You were either yielding a high return on investment, or you were a liability. My older brother, Harrison, was the blue-chip stock. He was handsome, charismatic, and supposedly breezing his way through a prestigious surgical residency in Boston. My younger sister, Beatrice, was the speculative growth asset. She was a striking blonde who spent her days cultivating a massive social media following, entirely funded by my father's brand incubation budget. And then there was me, Chloe, the middle child, the liability. I didn't want to be a doctor, and I certainly didn't want to be an internet personality. I was an engineer with a hyperfixation on materials science. For 3 years after college, while Harrison bragged about his rotations and Beatrice posted photos from yachts in Saint-Tropez, I had been working 80-hour weeks in a windowless, damp basement lab. I was developing a proprietary, plant-based polymer, a fully biodegradable alternative to single-use plastics that retained the durability of commercial synthetic rubber. I called it BioFlex. I knew I had something revolutionary. The preliminary stress tests were off the charts. I had interest from a massive packaging distributor in Seattle, but they needed a viable, scaled manufacturing run to sign a letter of intent. To secure the patent, finalize the prototype batch, and lock down the contract, I needed capital. Not a lot in the grand scheme of startup funding, but a fortune to a 25-year-old living on ramen. I needed $35,000. I spent weeks preparing the pitch for my parents. I bound the prospectus in leather. I had charts, market analysis, and a 5-year projection that showed a conservative 400% return. I dressed in my only tailored suit and brought the materials to Sunday dinner. I waited until the dessert plates were cleared. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I passed the glossy binders to my father and mother. "What's this, Chloe?" My father sighed, not even bothering to open it, using his silver fork to tap the cover as if testing it for venom. "It's my business plan, Dad. I've finalized the BioFlex formula. I have a distributor waiting in the wings. I just need a seed loan of $35,000 to cover the patent filing and the first production run. I'm offering you 20% equity, or I can structure it as a loan with 8% interest, to be paid back within 18 months. My mother let out a soft, breathy laugh, the kind she usually reserved for salespeople at the door. "Oh, sweetheart, a plastic company, really? After we paid for your degree, this is what you're doing? Melting things in a basement?" "It's not melting things, Mum. It's materials engineering. It's going to change how consumer goods are shipped." My father finally flipped open the binder, glancing at the executive summary for all of 4 seconds before snapping it shut. He pushed it back across the mahogany table. It slid like a hockey puck, stopping inches from my water glass. "Chloe, let me be frank," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, corporate baritone he used to fire people. I don't invest in fantasies. You lack the business acumen to run a company. You're disorganized, you're stubborn, and quite frankly, you've never shown the kind of exceptional promise that warrants this kind of risk. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Risk? Dad, you just bought Harrison a brand new Porsche Panamera for passing his preliminary boards. Harrison is going to be a cardiothoracic surgeon, my mother snapped, her posture rigid. He needs reliable, safe transportation. He's an asset to society. And what about Beatrice? I pushed, the bitterness finally leaking out. You just wired her $50,000 for a 3-month content creation trip to Bali. Beatrice is building a brand, my father retorted, his eyes narrowing. She has a following. She has metrics. What do you have? Smelly chemicals and a pipe dream. The answer is no, Chloe. You are not worth supporting on this fool's errand. It's time you grew up, abandoned this nonsense, and got a real job. Maybe Harrison can ask the hospital administration if they need a receptionist. The silence in the dining room was deafening. I looked at Beatrice, who was busy texting under the table, completely indifferent. I looked at Harrison, who offered a patronizing, pitying smile. A receptionist, I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. We're only telling you this because we love you, my mother added, reaching out to pat my hand, though her touch was ice cold. We have to protect our assets. We can't throw good money after bad. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply stood up, picked up the binder, and walked out the front door. I didn't know it then, but it would be the last time I set foot in that house for 5 years. The immediate aftermath of being cut off by your family is like stepping out of a warm house into a blizzard without a coat. You don't realize how much you relied on their ambient heat until it's gone. I had $412 in my checking account. I couldn't afford the rent on my apartment, let alone the chemicals I needed for the lab. I packed my entire life into the back of my beat-up 2008 Honda Civic. My best friend Maya offered me her couch in a cramped, 4th-floor walk-up in Brooklyn. I took it, promising her I'd only be there for a month. I was there for 8. Those 8 months were a masterclass in humiliation and endurance. To fund my patent filing, I worked 3 jobs. From 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., I was a barista at a high-end coffee shop in Manhattan, smiling at the kind of wealthy, suited men who looked exactly like my father. From 3 p.m. to 9 p.m., I did data entry for a logistics firm, and from 10 p.m. until 2 a.m., I was in a rented corner of a communal makerspace, refining the Bioflex polymer and cold emailing every venture capital firm, angel investor, and manufacturing CEO on the East Coast. I sent over 400 emails. I received 396 rejections or silences. The physical toll was immense. My hair started falling out in clumps from the stress. I lost 15 pounds I didn't have to lose because I was surviving on instant oatmeal and whatever stale pastries the coffee shop let me take home at the end of my shift. I remember sitting on the floor of the subway one night at 3 a.m., crying so hard I couldn't breathe, wondering if my parents had been right. Maybe I was a bad investment. Maybe I was delusional. But then, the twist happened. It wasn't a business twist. It was a personal one, and it changed the entire trajectory of my life. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished my barista shift and was sitting in a cheap diner, utilizing their free Wi-Fi to send out another batch of pitches. Maya texted me. She worked as a paralegal at a boutique law firm that handled debt restructuring and bankruptcy for high-net-worth individuals. Maya, you need to call me right now. Go outside. I stepped into the freezing November wind and dialed her number. Chloe, Maya said, her voice hushed but frantic. I shouldn't be telling you this. It's a massive breach of confidentiality. but I just saw a file cross my boss's desk. Maya, what is it? I'm freezing. It's Harrison, your brother. I rolled my eyes. What, did he buy another Porsche and need a tax loophole? No, Chloe, Maya said, taking a deep breath. He's drowning. He's hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Gambling, offshore sports betting, underground poker rings in Boston. The works. He didn't just fail his preliminary boards, he never even took them. He dropped out of his residency program 9 months ago. The street traffic seemed to mute around me. What? That's impossible. My parents just bought him. A car, Maya interrupted. Chloe, the car was a bribe, or a cover-up. The file I'm looking at? It shows a private loan of nearly $200,000 taken out by your father, Richard, used to quietly settle a debt with some very unsavory private lenders in Massachusetts. Your parents know. They've known for months. I leaned against the brick wall of the diner, the rough stone biting into my shoulder. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped together with sickening clarity. The Sunday dinner. The absolute refusal to give me $35,000. My father's sweating brow when I asked for the money. My mother's overly defensive posturing about Harrison being an asset to society. They hadn't just rejected me because they didn't believe in me. They rejected me because they were secretly bleeding cash to cover up the golden child's catastrophic, criminal failures. They let me sit there and be humiliated, let me be called a bad investment, all while pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into a black hole of gambling debt just to save the family's public image. The sadness I had been carrying for months evaporated. It didn't turn into anger. It turned into something much colder, much harder. It turned into titanium. I walked back into the diner, sat down, and opened an email from a man named Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was a semi-retired angel investor I had pitched 2 weeks prior. He was notoriously gruff, old school, and hard to impress. He had replied to my pitch with a single sentence. Prove the tensile strength metrics are real in person, and we can talk. I hadn't responded, because I couldn't afford a flight to his office in Chicago. But now, I pulled out my laptop, logged into my bank account, and looked at my meager savings. $850. I booked a one-way ticket to Chicago for $400. The next morning, I walked into Arthur Pendleton's massive glass-walled office overlooking Lake Michigan. I didn't wear a suit this time. I wore a plain black turtleneck, jeans, and carried a duffel bag containing a portable vice grip, a 50-pound dumbbell, and 3 sheets of BioFlex. Arthur sat behind his desk, raising a thick grey eyebrow as I walked in. You're smaller than I expected, Chloe. And your profit margins in the sustainable sector are smaller than they should be, Arthur, I shot back, not missing a beat. The ghost of my father's condescension was gone. I was untouchable now. I spent the next 2 hours destroying his office. I wrapped a sheet of BioFlex around the 50-pound dumbbell and hung it from a ceiling beam to prove it wouldn't tear. I submerged another prototype in a tank of heated acidic water he had his assistants fetch, showing how it maintained its molecular integrity. I didn't beg. I didn't ask for a favor. I showed him the future. When I was done, I was sweating, and my hands were shaking from the adrenaline. Arthur just sat there, staring at the suspended dumbbell. Finally, he leaned forward, steepling his fingers. You asked for $35,000 for 20% equity in your email. The price went up, I said, my voice steady. I want $150,000. I need a dedicated lab space, a patent attorney, and a full manufacturing run, and you're only getting 15%. Arthur let out a booming laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "You've got balls, kid. I'll give you 150, but I want 18%, and I want a seat on the advisory board to make sure you don't burn the place down." "Deal," I said, shaking his hand. I flew back to New York that night. Over the next 3 years, I didn't speak a word to my family. I changed my phone number. I scrubbed my personal social media. I ceased to exist to them. Instead, I built an empire. The transition from a desperate 25-year-old in a freezing Brooklyn makerspace to the CEO of a multi-million-dollar materials engineering firm didn't happen overnight. It happened in agonizing, sleepless increments over 36 grueling months. With Arthur Pendleton's $150,000 seed capital safely secured in a corporate account, I didn't celebrate. I went to work. I relocated to an industrial park in Newark, New Jersey, leasing a warehouse that smelled permanently of rust and old cardboard. I hired 2 brilliant, hungry chemical engineering PhD dropouts, and we spent the first 8 months scaling the BioFlex prototype into a continuous manufacturing line. I retained a ferocious intellectual property attorney from Cravath, Swain and Moore, a woman named Evelyn Sterling, who billed $1,200 an hour and was worth every single penny. She locked down the patents for BioFlex so tightly that not even a microscopic variance in the polymer chain could be replicated by competitors. By month 14, we had our first successful mass production run. By month 18, I walked into the global headquarters of Amazon Logistics in Seattle and dropped a completely biodegradable, waterproof, tear-resistant mailer on the procurement director's desk. I showed them how it decomposed in standard compost within 90 days, leaving 0 microplastics. I showed them the cost analysis. They signed a multi-year, 9-figure vendor contract 3 weeks later. When the news hit the industry wire, it triggered a feeding frenzy. Venture capital firms that had previously ignored my emails were suddenly flooding my inbox. We closed a Series A funding round, led by Andreessen Horowitz, that valued BioFlex at $450 million. At 28 years old, my personal net worth crossed the 9-figure threshold. I moved out of the warehouse and into a penthouse in Tribeca. I bought Maya a pristine, renovated brownstone in Park Slope as a thank you for the 8 months on her couch. But while my trajectory was shooting into the stratosphere, my family was in a terrifying, uncontrolled freefall. I knew this because I wasn't leaving anything to chance. The moment I secured the Amazon contract, I hired a premier private intelligence firm, Blackthorne and Associates, headed by a former forensic accountant named Vale Graham. I didn't hire Vale because I missed my parents or my siblings. I hired him to monitor them, to ensure they couldn't attempt to claim intellectual property rights by arguing I had conceptualized BioFlex under their roof. I needed to know every move they made. The quarterly dossiers Vale delivered to my office were a masterclass in watching a dynasty devour itself. It turned out Harrison's Boston gambling debts were just the tip of the iceberg. To pay off the unsavory lenders, my father, Richard, had quietly leveraged his own client portfolios at Morgan Stanley. When the market took a sudden, volatile dip in my second year of business, the discrepancies in his accounts were flagged by internal auditors. He was given a choice: face federal prosecution for embezzlement or quietly resign, forfeit his severance, and liquidate his personal assets to restore the missing funds. He chose the latter. He was stripped of his title, his reputation, and his income. The financial panic in my childhood home must have been suffocating. To keep up appearances, my mother, Sylvia, insisted they maintain their membership at the country club and continue funding Beatrice's superficial influencer lifestyle. They took out a brutal second mortgage on the sprawling Connecticut estate. But Beatrice's brand was entirely built on a foundation of my parents' cash. When the wire transfers stopped, she couldn't afford the luxury trips, the designer clothes, or the bought followers. Within 6 months, her engagement tanked, her sponsorships dried up, and she was forced to move back into the Connecticut house, screaming at my mother about ruining her aesthetic. As for Harrison, without a residency, without a medical license, and cut off from the bank of Mom and Dad, he attempted to launch a concierge wellness consulting business. It was a spectacular failure that ended with a lawsuit from a former client over fraudulent health claims. By the end of my 3rd year running BioFlex, the family that had called me a liability was functionally bankrupt. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on the Connecticut estate. The cars were repossessed. And then, the contents of the house, the physical manifestations of their pride and status, were put up for a public estate auction to satisfy their remaining creditors. Vale Graham sat across from me, in my sleek, glass-walled office in Manhattan, sliding the auction catalogue across my desk. "They're liquidating everything on the 12th of next month," Vale said, his voice flat and professional. "Artwork, vehicles, furniture. Do you need me to monitor the buyers in case they try to hide assets?" I opened the catalogue. I flipped past the Persian rugs and the crystal chandeliers. I stopped on page 42. Lot 108. Custom Italian mahogany dining table. Seats 12. Excellent condition. I stared at the photograph of the table. The same table where my father had dismissed my dreams. The same table where my mother had laughed at me. The same table where I was told I wasn't worth $35,000, while they secretly flushed hundreds of thousands down the drain for a degenerate gambler. A cold, hard smile crept onto my face. "Vale," I said softly, "I want you to set up a blind LLC, something untraceable to my name." "Done. What are we acquiring?" "Lot 108, I replied, tapping the glossy page. "Bid whatever it takes. Do not lose that table, and when you win it, I want it delivered directly to my corporate boardroom." The reckoning didn't happen in a courtroom or a dark alley. It happened on a Tuesday morning, right after my picture appeared on the cover of Forbes magazine under the headline, "The Polymer Princess: How Chloe Redefined Sustainable Shipping and Built a $500 million Empire." I knew the article would be the flare in the night sky. Up until that point, my family thought I was still slumming it in a basement, mixing chemicals for pennies. I had intentionally kept a low media profile during our scaling phase, operating entirely under the corporate veil of BioFlex. But the Amazon deal and the subsequent Series A funding made anonymity impossible. It took exactly 4 days for them to find me. I was reviewing a quarterly supply chain report when my executive assistant, Thomas, buzzed my intercom. His voice was laced with hesitation. "Mr. CEO, there are 3 people in the lobby, a Richard, Sylvia, and Harrison. They're claiming to be your immediate family. Security stopped them at the elevator banks, but they are making quite a scene, stating it's a family emergency." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, feeling the steady, calm rhythm of my own pulse. I wasn't the terrified 25-year-old anymore. I was the apex predator in this building. "Send them up to the executive boardroom, Thomas," I said smoothly. "Offer them sparkling water. I'll be in shortly." I waited exactly 25 minutes before leaving my office. Let them sweat. Let them sit in the silence. When I finally pushed open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom, the scene was almost perfectly choreographed. My father looked 10 years older, the arrogant posture replaced by a slight, defeated stoop. He was wearing a suit that was visibly worn at the cuffs. My mother's usually immaculate blonde hair was frazzled, and she clutched a designer handbag that looked suspiciously empty. Harrison just looked hollow, his eyes darting around the massive, sunlit room, taking in the panoramic views of the Manhattan skyline. And they were all sitting around the custom Italian mahogany dining table. They hadn't noticed. The boardroom was so large, the table just looked like a standard piece of corporate furniture. "Chloe!" my mother gasped, leaping up and rushing toward me with her arms outstretched. "Oh, my darling girl, we've been looking everywhere for you." I stepped smoothly to the side, letting her grab empty air. "Hello, Sylvia. Richard. Harrison. To what do I owe the pleasure?" My father cleared his throat, trying to muster the old baritone authority, but it cracked. "Chloe, please, let's not be formal. We are family. We saw the magazine. We are so incredibly proud of you." "Proud," I repeated, walking to the head of the table and taking a seat. I didn't offer them one. "Of course we are," Harrison chimed in, leaning forward, flashing a desperate version of his old charismatic smile. "We always knew you were the smart one, the engineer. We knew you'd figure it out." "Did you?" I asked, lacing my fingers together and resting them on the polished mahogany. "Because the last time we spoke, 5 years ago, I believe the exact phrasing used was that I was a bad investment, a liability, and that my company was a fool's errand." My father waved his hand dismissively, though his hand was shaking. "Chloe, you have to understand context. I was testing you. In the business world, you need a thick skin. If I had just handed you the money, you wouldn't have possessed the drive to build all of this. I made you resilient." It was such a spectacular, audacious lie that I actually laughed out loud. The sound echoed off the glass walls. "You made me resilient?" I leaned forward. "Richard, you didn't give me the $35,000 because you didn't have it to spare. You were too busy liquidating your own assets to cover Harrison's $200,000 gambling debts with the Boston Underground." The color completely drained from my father's face. Harrison visibly flinched, shrinking back into his chair. My mother let out a strangled gasp. "How?" my father stammered. "I run a $500 million company," I said coldly. "Information is my currency. I know everything. I know you were forced out of Morgan Stanley for embezzling client funds to cover the shortfall. I know the Connecticut house was foreclosed on. I know Beatrice is living in a rented studio in Queens. And I know Harrison is facing 3 civil suits for fraud." Silence descended on the room, heavy and suffocating. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, I had entirely obliterated it. "Chloe, please," my mother finally sobbed, her manicured hands trembling on the table. "We are drowning. We have nothing left. We're living in a miserable 2-bedroom apartment. Your father can't find work. We are your family. We gave you life. You have so much. Surely you can help us. Just a small loan, $1 million. It's nothing to you now. Just to get us back on our feet." $1 million, I mused, looking at Harrison. Is that the going rate for a bailout these days? Or are the bookies raising their interest rates? "Chloe, stop it," my father snapped, a brief, desperate flash of his old temper surfacing. "Have some respect. You owe us." "I owe you absolutely nothing," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You treated this family like a corporate balance sheet. You categorized your children as assets and liabilities. You bet everything on the blue-chip stock," I pointed at Harrison. "And the speculative asset." I gestured vaguely to where Beatrice would be. "You told me I wasn't worth the risk. Well, you were wrong. And in business, when you fail to invest early, you don't get to demand a share of the dividends when the company goes public. I reached under the table and pressed a small button. A moment later, the boardroom doors opened and Thomas stepped in, flanked by 2 large security guards. "Ms. CEO?" Thomas asked. "Thomas, my guests were just leaving," I said, standing up. "Chloe, you can't do this!" my mother shrieked, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "We have nowhere else to go. We are your blood. Blood is just biology, Sylvia. Loyalty is a choice, and you made yours 5 years ago." I walked over to the door, turning back to look at them one last time. They looked so incredibly small, sitting around that massive expanse of wood. "By the way," I said, tapping the surface of the table, "did you notice the boardroom furniture? I bought it at your bankruptcy auction last month. It cost me exactly $35,000. Funny how the universe balances the books, isn't it?" My father stared down at the polished mahogany, his eyes wide with a horrified, soul-crushing realization. He trailed his fingers over the custom inlay, recognizing the table he had shipped from Italy, the table where he had destroyed my spirit. He couldn't speak. He just sat there, a broken man at a table he no longer owned. "Show them out, Thomas," I commanded, "and if they ever approach the building again, have them arrested for trespassing." I didn't stay to watch them be escorted to the elevators. I walked back into my office, closed the door, and looked out over the city. The sky was clear, the horizon endless, and for the first time in my entire life, the ledger was perfectly balanced. They thought starving me of support would break my spirit, but it only taught me how to feast on my own ambition. Today, they scramble for a seat at the table they once banished me from, waving their empty plates. But the doors are locked, the accounts are sealed, and the truth is finally out. I built my kingdom from the scraps they threw away, and I'm keeping the crown.